Eternal God, we claim that you make each of us, that in this life you walk with us and are with us. On this day I claim that you are present with Kim and the children, that you have welcomed Joe home, and that you will be with us, your people, Joe's family, Joe's friends, as we continue to find and seek your guidance and your will in our lives. I pray this in the name of your Holy Son, Jesus. Amen. Our text this morning is from the Old Testament book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, and it's the first 20 verses of the 3rd chapter. Now there was a boy, Samuel, serving the Lord under Eli. The Lord's word was rare at that time, and visions were not widely known. One day Eli, whose eyes had grown so weak that he was unable to see, was lying down in his room. God's lamp hadn't gone out yet, and Samuel was lying down in the Lord's temple, where the Lord's chest was. The Lord called to Samuel. "I'm here," he said. Samuel hurried to Eli and said, "I'm here, Eli. You called me?" "I didn't call you," Eli replied. "Go lie down." So he did. Again the Lord called Samuel. So Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "I'm here. You called me?" "I didn't call, my son," Eli replied. "Go and lie down." Now Samuel didn't yet know the Lord, and the Lord's word had not been revealed to him. A third time the Lord called Samuel. He got up, he went to Eli and said, "I'm here. You called me." Then Eli realized that it was the Lord who was calling Samuel, calling the boy. So Eli said to Samuel, "Go and lie down. And if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down where he'd been. Then the Lord came and stood there, calling just as before, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel said, "Speak, your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of all who hear it tingle. On that day I will bring to pass against Eli everything I said about his household, every last bit of it. I told him that I would punish his family forever because of the wrongdoing he knew about, how his sons were cursing God. But he wouldn't stop them. Because of that, I swore about Eli's household that his family's wrongdoing would never be reconciled by sacrifice or by offering." Samuel lay there until morning, then opened the doors of the Lord's house. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel, saying, "Samuel, my son." "I'm here," Samuel said. "What did he say to you?" Eli asked. "Don't hide anything from me. May God deal harshly with you, and worse still, if you hide from me a single word of everything he said to you." So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. "He is the Lord," Eli said. "He will do as he pleases." So Samuel grew up, and the Lord was with him, not allowing any of his words to fail. All Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was trustworthy as the Lord's prophet. This is the word of God for the people of God. It's a call story. It's titled in my Bible, "God's Call to Samuel." And preachers and church folk love these kind of stories because, all of us have heard God's voice in some way. Maybe not exactly like this, but all of us, if we haven't heard God's voice, are seeking to know God's will, no matter who we are, so that our lives can have meaning and be abundant and productive. It's a favorite kind of story for preachers and for church folk to like. Because It reminds us of what can be. But this is also more than just a call story. It's a story about the changing of the guard in Hebrew religion. It's a story about an old priest, Eli, who has spent his entire life in service to the Lord. He has lovingly lived and cared for the temple at Shiloh. While he's there, he's watched and taken care of the tabernacle. The ark of the Lord was under his care. He has patiently and faithfully served the Lord and has been listening for years, maybe a lifetime, to hear the voice of God. And he has not heard God speak to him. I can't imagine a tougher reality for a priest or a person of religion not to have experienced the real nature of God in life. And yet Eli doesn't seem to have had that experience. In fact, the writer of the book says that Eli's eyes had grown weak, literally. He was unable to see, and yet he guarded the ark with his life. It's a story of transition. It's a terrible place, I would guess, for Eli to be. But it's where Eli is. It is a call story. It's a story where Samuel, a young boy, hears God's voice. But it's actually a call story that doesn't begin here. It begins in the nature of the nation of Israel. Israel at the time of Eli and Samuel was not a unified country. It was scattered, it was struggling, it was not a place that God's covenant and God's word seemed to be alive and well. It was a place where we're told earlier in Samuel that God's people were choosing not to follow the covenant and were worshiping gods of Canaan. They were wandering from their Lord. And to make it worse, the Philistines, a powerful, warlike nation, had appeared and were beginning to destroy the very structure and fabric of the nation and of religious life. It was a terrible time. Great discomfort, great questions about what is going to happen. But the writer of Samuel tells us that something happened. It was a prayer, really. A simple prayer from an older, barren woman. And the prayer to God was really kind of one of those, God, if you'll do this for me, I'll do this for you kind of prayers in reality. God, if I have a child, I'll dedicate him or her to your service. You know, and God really seems to have a way of sometimes responding even to prayers like that. And he does. Hannah has a child. And she comes to that point after birthing that son, that treasured young man that she'd been waiting for all of her life. And she has a decision to make. Does she forget her promise to God? Or does she keep her promise? You see, Samuel is at the temple that night because his mother has given him to the service of the Lord. He's there every day. He sleeps there. He eats there. He's there to do what needs to be done to assist the old priest Eli. He is Eli's helper in the work of the Lord. And you heard the story, right? He goes to bed. His bed would have been the same bed he slept in every night. He watched the ark at night. He slept near that because Eli was pretty useless at that point. Couldn't see, couldn't hear, wasn't much use there. But as Samuel goes to bed on that night, I would imagine his eyes were just beginning to close, and he heard a voice. Samuel. Samuel. Eli, I'm here. What do you need? Was Samuel's reply. Eli said to Samuel, I didn't call you. Go back to bed. Go back to sleep. And Samuel did, I guess. But after he laid there for a short time, he heard it again. Samuel, Samuel. Eli, I'm coming. What do you need from me? I didn't call you. Go back to bed. We need a good night's rest. We got a lot to do tomorrow. You know, we got to polish the ark. We got to clean the floors. We got to do all the things that have to be done. Go back to bed. And Samuel does. And just as his eyes were closing, he heard again, Samuel, Samuel. Eli, I'm coming. What can I do? And old Eli realizes, he's not dumb, he realizes what is happening. He realizes that Samuel is hearing a voice that he has never heard. And so he says to Samuel, if you hear that voice again, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. Samuel lays down. And sure enough, the voice spoke again, Samuel, Samuel. And this time, Samuel replied, speak, Lord, your servant's listening. And not only did Samuel listen, Samuel heard, and Samuel chose to respond to what he heard, and he was willing to share the truth that he now knew. That's a call story. That's what it is. That's why we love it. It's what it is. It's a good reminder. It's that kind of feeling about God having chosen someone, somewhere to speak to and gave the opportunity to respond to. But the story doesn't end there. The call story ends there. That's fine. That's done. But in the 11th verse of that chapter, the whole emphasis and focus shifts to something very different. Because the call moves from being a call to becoming a promise from God. It's a promise directed at Samuel, but that resonates down to each of us here today. One of the difficulties and one of the risks about reading the scriptures and reading stories like this and saying, that's where I fit, is that sometimes we miss the fact that the Bible is written not so we can see ourselves, but so that we can see God and experience God in our lives. Will Willimon, in his book, Proclamation and Theology, writes that the scriptures always and everywhere speak primarily of God and only secondarily about us. The story becomes a story about God. And that shift occurs when Samuel says, speak, Lord, I'm listening. I'm about to do something, Samuel seems to be saying. But the next words that God speaks to Samuel is a statement from God about what God is going to do. I love this language. I'm about to do something in Israel that will make the ears of all who hear tingle. Do you kind of get a funny feeling up your spine when they cranked in the trumpets on that opening hymn? That kind of tingle. Ooh, I've heard something out of the ordinary. That's what God says to Samuel. You're about, all of you, Israel, everybody's about to hear words that are going to be out of the ordinary. And your challenge is probably going to be whether you hear them whether you'll admit you heard them, and whether you'll choose to respond. But the promise of God is not based upon God's willingness to speak, but upon the fact that when God speaks, God reminds us of God's presence. A presence that occurs in a way that our ears tingle, our actions, our bodies change. Our understanding of life is shaped. When I was much younger, and I really was younger at one time, like most of you were, I used to see the word a little different than I do now. I've loved this passage. It's been one I've always liked to go back and read and use, but I've begun to read it in a different way now that I'm getting more like Eli than Samuel. My ears are failing, my eye, and we don't want to talk about my legs and my knees. I don't hear the primary message here like I used to. I don't hear God saying, I'm going to hold you accountable for how well the temple's been cleaned and whether there's oil in the candlesticks and whether you do all the things in the right order they should be done. Instead, I hear covenant being defined in terms of how God's relationship with you and me, us, is shaped our lives together. How God's covenant moves our lives and shapes our hearts and opens us to the reality of the world around us. I don't see the truth of this story too much any longer of God judging Eli and his family. That's a part of it. But I see that when God speaks and people listen, God speaks words of truth. And in those words of truth, there is judgment, but they're always spoken with God's language of love. A language of love which reminds the hearer, the doer, the person who seeks to respond to God's call and presence in life that we are capable of setting the captives free. We're capable of living in a world which is just and righteous because that's what we demand from the world around us. We're capable of speaking a language of love and life that's heard by all people. Yesterday was one of the most difficult days of ministry in my life. On Friday, there was such hope. And yet, yesterday morning, all that hope of healing and what was going to happen seemingly was dashed and disappeared. As we stood in that intensive care room, I felt and knew that the question that was being asked was a question I could not answer, no one could. The question of how. How could this happen? Why would it happen? I didn't have an answer for it. I wasn't hearing the words that would ring true to the reality of that situation. And as we just stood around the bed, holding each other, reminding each other that we weren't alone, sharing our physical presence with Kim and all the family, I found no help except in the clear sense of the presence of hurting people standing and living together. The hope wasn't from us. It could only be from God. As crazy as it sounds, in the back of my head, I kept thinking and singing to myself the little ditty we used in church a month ago. Jesus' blood never failed me. yet. Never failed me yet. Jesus' love never failed me, and this thing I know for sure. He never will. I kept thinking that. And something happened at some point in that room that could only be described as the presence of God. I don't know how and who said what. But we began to talk about and think about and absorb not the issue of how and why, but the claim of who Joe Morrison was. I mean, how he was a stay-at-home dad. He was raising a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old. How his character, how his language, how his demeanor, more often than not, presented a loving presence beyond human description. And as we talked and lived through that reality, the evidence of the clear voice of God speaking, at least into my confusion and pain, was clearly there. It was the language of love, speaking God's truth. When I finally went home last night, I kind of knew I was going to be rewriting a sermon for today. As I was thinking through the day and kind of processing, I remembered something. In 1976, I was assigned to my first local church. Bless their hearts, I was a mess. I didn't have a clue what to do as a pastor in a local church. Yet I knew how to work with kids. That's kind of what I did. And the first year, at the end of that first year, that church had made a decision that we would take our youth group, about 20 kids, 15 to 20 kids, on a mission trip. First time that church had ever done that. They'd been to Six Flags, but never on a trip like mission trip. And since I didn't know much about where to go except where I'd been, we determined that we would go to Atlanta and we would work in a neighborhood that I used to live and work in. One of the really kind of serendipities, God things that happened to me in seminary was I actually met Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., Daddy King. I mean, he was this international figure. I lived down the street from the church and just met him. He didn't know me, I'm sure, but I knew him. And out of the blue, I said, if we're going to Atlanta, we're going to talk to kids, and we're going to do a vacation Bible school about God's love and hope and how we live through that, let's get him to come and talk with those kids. And I sent him a letter, not really expecting him to agree to come, by the way. But he did. We set a day. And to this day, I can tell you exactly what day and time he showed up, because it was the Friday of the week that James Earl Ray was loose in the mountains of North Georgia and Tennessee, having escaped from prison, where he was assigned or sent because of his murder of Martin Luther King Jr. And Daddy King showed up. We gathered this 30 kids from that housing project and 15, 20 kids from an upper middle class suburban neighborhood in St. Petersburg. We all got together. We sat on the ground outside under a tree. Daddy King came in this big car with very large armed guards. Sat down in an old metal folding chair and kind of sat there. He was a big man, but he was not a tall man. And he sat there and he began to talk about his life. He talked about the hope that he had, how he saw the world changing, and how good that was. He saw a difference, and as he went through that speech, I don't remember specifics. I just remember feeling like he was sharing himself with us. And then he stopped and he said, I want to answer any questions you guys have. Now, every group of kids has one kid. You know the one? The one that always raises their hand first, the one that always asks the question you wish they wouldn't ask. That was David. I knew him. He was 8 years old. He lived in Capitol Homes. That was his pattern. The hand pops up. I'm thinking, please don't let him ask that question. But Daddy King says, what can I help you with? And the boy looked up and he said, what do you think about that man who's loose in the mountains right now? I mean, remember, Martin Luther King Sr. had lost and buried 2 sons. He had buried his wife of 50-plus years after she'd been shot and killed at the organ at the church at Ebenezer. That was less than 2 years before we were sitting under that tree. And I'll never forget it.